Today we're going to talk about is a little bit about our survey that we just pushed out last week. Really excited about some of the results in there, but we're going to do our best to make it real, right? Survey is not just data, but what's behind it, what we learned from it, what we could predict would happen, what we learned from it, and then to ground it out by what we see in the market today. So we'll go through the survey, drill down on a couple of industries that we focus on, and if time permits, we'll have a little bit of Q&A at the end. A little bit about who's before you today. My name is Rob Massey. I'm a tax partner, and I lead everything tax for blockchain and crypto within Deloitte. Having a good time with that across all industry use cases, across blockchain implementations, a lot with digital assets, and in the investing space. Amy?
Amy Steele, I'm a partner in our audit services. I lead our strategy as it relates to blockchain and digital assets from an audit perspective. I also do a lot of work with the AICPA. I lead our digital assets task force and with other regulatory bodies.
And my name is Linda Plachek, and I lead our consulting practice for blockchain.
And I'm Wendy Henry, and I lead our government and public services blockchain practice.
And I'm Tim Davis. I'm a principal in our risk and financial advisory practice, and I coordinate what we do around blockchain assurance globally for Deloitte.
So good cross-section of us here today. What's important when we, as a firm, a lot of different competencies represented, a lot of different geographies represented, is when we talk about a topic as provocative and evolving as blockchain, we bring a lot of lenses to the equation. And that is really what the survey was meant to get at. And then as we digest what comes out of the survey, what do we think about it, again, applying those different lenses? But the survey was quite broad, right? And we went out and learning from our earlier surveys about who we wanted to participate and the learnings therein. But I think the breadth is something that we can be proud of in terms of the representation of the correspondents and the geographies represented. Linda, anything else you want to add there?
Sure. Jumping into a few key points, how many of you maybe have gone out to Deloitte.com? By the way, I'm hearing a little feedback from the back here. Thank you very much. How many of you have gone out to perhaps Deloitte.com, or you've seen a LinkedIn page and you've downloaded the survey? Anyone? Okay, a few. Thank you. Thank you. So let me bring it to life back to not only the coverage, but more importantly, as perhaps you participated last year. We had our second annual survey results last year, and then this makes it our third. The important thing when you're polling for information is we really are looking for sentiments and trending. The nature of the survey, if you have read it, is looking to really ratify that we're moving out of this spirit of disbelief. We're moving away from what has been engendered because of the attachment and the inextricable link of blockchain to crypto around things like hype. And we're looking for patterns that are really starting to be identified as emerging as to net value. And so when we look at our survey, and again, Deloitte.com, you can download it on that site or anyone's LinkedIn page from our key blockchain team at Deloitte, is there's a few things emerging. One is the sentiment that there continues to be actually an increase in the appetite to begin to instantiate viable use cases. So 2 points in there. One is we continue to see the uptick the pattern in that there's interest, and two is there's more viable use cases. I think one of the most significant things that was identified around this position of maturing is the position that was uncovered around not only do we see more viable use cases, but we are seeing measurable results. If you look even back 2 and 3 years ago, the question is what was the pattern? And as the analogy I often use is 2 dots equal a line, but more dots give you a more certain line, and that would be a scattergram. And so what we're seeing through the evidence of the survey is there is awareness and a positive indicator that suggests that we're not seeing people trailing off, but that we're seeing at least maintain, and in fact, 10% uptick in the fact that organizations are seeing blockchain not only just as a priority, but they're seeing it important. And that's over 80% of all enterprises surveyed see it fall into what I would call the top quartile of the importance as an enterprise where blockchain sits. Moreover, one of the more interesting facts was nearly 60% of those respondents around the legitimacy and maturing of blockchain suggest that if they don't participate, they will be competitively disadvantaged. So I think back to my scattergram analogy is we're seeing, and the evidence suggests that there are much more positive sentiments, and they continue to propel themselves forward. So we're not seeing trailing off. The other thing that was interesting is we talk about it's no longer a discussion about will it work, but rather how will it work for me. Now, as we look at what has been a myriad of use cases out there, no surprise. I look in this audience, I think many of us can take ourselves back to the 1990s when the internet was first new and media and retail were the predominant use cases in the 90s. It took about 10 years before we saw some maturing occur, and in fact, its frozen state was in the early 2000s, and suddenly we see commerce like we've never seen before. So I see that one of the other parts that gets a little bit more granular around the maturity, and I'm often asked, is this another flash in the pan? I think what particularly certain people who are reporting on this have lost their minds because they've lost their patience. Right? This is no longer standing in front of the microwave, tapping your foot, I don't have all minute to wait. The reality is we are seeing through discovery, more unknowns become known and more unknowns of unknowns. Right? We are going through this period of discovery, and all of this legitimizes through the process of answering the harder questions. But what we're seeing in will it work for us is what the executives are, at least our experiences, and I speak on behalf of the Deloitte organization across all of our functions, is executives are asking more granular questions. It's no longer the blockchain FOMO, please do something fast, I feel like I'm missing out, to we're now seeing a lot of more sensible discussions around and the granularity of the discussions. The granularity, though, extends into one of the other elements of what are some of the challenges. I don't want to call them barriers, but challenges that you'll see in the survey as well. On the enterprise side versus on the emerging disruptor side, we know the emerging disruptors are in fact the leading innovators of what happens in this platform, in fact leading innovators when any technology evolution or revolution comes to be. And they're taking full advantage of native blockchain and native crypto platforms to be able to propel their business cases and their businesses forward, which is what is actually lending an advantage to the enterprises, because we're learning a lot from what the emerging disruptors are. They're thinking differently about blockchain and crypto and token-based business models because why? They're unconstrained. They don't have the 100 years of history of some of the traditional enterprises, and they surely don't have the waxy buildup as you look across business processes. But the granularity of the questions being asked are important, because for all of us who have ventured into the land of blockchain and crypto and token models, the harder part isn't necessarily figuring out the technology. The technology is actually advancing itself, and it will figure itself out over time. The harder part is, because of this capability, we're living in a multi-enterprise type of relationship. So the harder part is unwinding governance models. In fact, when we talk to clients, one of the things I heard clients say, and it was reinforced in here around models of consortium, is figuring out that rule set and actually figuring out the economics associated with the participation in the rule set associated with a consortium, which is listed in here. In fact, what I hear from clients and what they're absolutely vehemently opposed to is participation in a consortium where they feel like there's a big brother that's imposing an economic model upon them. It flies in the face, and it shows in the consortium evidence that we have and other work we're doing around consortiums, leveraging our global network, that consortiums are a very important part of the private permission blockchain state, but it is also one of the most complex elements of standing up blockchain. So while I could elaborate much further on what you will see in the survey, it is important what you take away from it is three things. One is we are definitely seeing evidence that it is moving towards a more mature state. It's by far mature. It's probably in what we would categorically say adolescence, because we are learning and there are more unknowns that are being discovered. The reality of those things that are in production, it's lending a lot of insight into how to create things that can succeed in the marketplace. And that's public service in the government sector, that's in all the traditional enterprise sectors. But again, those emerging disruptors are doing some extraordinary things to give us new insights and unconstrained models. So maturing is key. The second point around the ecosystem, it remains one of the hardest parts to solve for in the context of all things blockchain, crypto, and token. And with that, we'll begin a discussion here now around not so much the evidence, but the way it's manifesting itself through some real success in the market with emerging disruptors, as well as government and other traditional industry plays.
I mean, we immerse ourselves in this industry all day, every day, right? This is all we focus on. And so it's easy for us to say, oh yeah, this stuff is real, right? Because it's all we do. It's important for us to see validation through a survey to say, wow, this really is a critical priority. There is a sense of maturity out there. All these people we don't know every day, right? We can tell the people we serve, but when you cast the net out there and say, wow, this really is a big deal. It validates we're doing the right thing. But the insights we're seeing is it really is across every industry you can imagine. And we're seeing both large-scale enterprises, which we work with every day, but the data shows that there's just a ton of momentum out there. People not just, touring their way through what does this mean for them, but making it a critical priority and assigning people and headcount and the investment, dedicated investment, real dollars, going towards something which is hard, right? This is really hard across all of our competencies. And we get in the room and we debate these new business models and super provocative topics, and we're like, wow, it's hard in one lens, but when you put all of us together, it's some really interesting stuff to wrangle with. So the maturity shows, I think, that people are taking it serious, and it's worth the effort to get it right. So the maturity is a big deal. You referenced the emerging disruptors. This is where I personally spend a lot of time in, and it's so interesting to watch the convergence of somebody with this really provocative new business model, which could disrupt one of the mature state players out there. And we're watching them actually come together. We're seeing industry vets team up with super early stage startup companies to develop something which isn't just an academic exercise, but which is going to be real and it works because of their connections in the space and their realities of what it takes to actually implement something which is really, truly, unusual and different in terms of innovative business models. So pretty exciting stuff. We're proud of what's in there. You hear some of that enthusiasm play out today. But important to get into, what's real about what's happening. And we chose a few industries just to get into it and bring some real life examples. Again, we serve across all these different industries. When I think of healthcare, right, I don't think blockchain first. But so interesting in that when we do study healthcare across a broad spectrum in the space, when you think about pharma, when you think about the actual services provided, you think about insurance, throughout all of the different elements of healthcare, there's a lot going on in blockchain and real life use cases taking place and people getting into it. And I know, Wendy, you spend a lot of time in this space. Can you just talk a little about what's going on there and some of the players and what are some of the new things actually grabbing hold, making it real for this group?
Yeah, so one of the great things about being in government and public services, which is government, state and local, and public higher education, is when you talk about that cross-industry, we get to look across many different facets of any given industry and a lot of those industry interactions. And so healthcare has been one of those places where, surprisingly, there's been an incredible amount of interest, both on industry but also on government. And when we talk about government, we have to look at government through three different lenses. We have to look at them as the regulator, right? And we hear a lot about that mostly with regards to SEC, but we also have to think about the fact that every single one of those agencies that comprise our government may act as a regulator in some circumstances, and healthcare's part of that with FDA. But we have to look at them as the regulator, the regulated, and then the user of the technology. And so there's three very different lenses that we look at blockchain through. So when you look at, just recently, there's a pilot that's been approved by the FDA. So the FDA has the DSCSA, which is the Drug Supply Chain Security Act. And it's been in play for a while. But some of the stuff that comes along with regulation makes it really hard. Right? So the transparency, the immutability, the traceability and accountability that we get with blockchain starts to make the role of the regulator a little bit easier. And so there's now a pilot. There's about 7 different organizations or entities that are going to be part of a consortium that are going to look at a secured supply chain of products of drugs. And in fact, as they do that, they'll be coming into compliance with the regulation that's been very paper intensive, had a lot of gaps. when you look at other uses, and you start to look at where else government's looking into healthcare, you get a wide variety. So data commons. Government is a huge steward of a lot of data. And data that has to be protected, data that has to be secured, but data also that has to be verified. And so when we look across the spectrum of where government's looking at that stuff, you look at NIH, right? There's a lot of data that's collected, and yet the researchers want attribution. And so a lot of that data isn't shared because they won't get proper attribution. And yet, when you look at organizations in the mission of NIH, it's been stated that it's possible that some of the cures to some of the most horrible diseases is out there if the data could be brought together. But that data is not brought together. So data commons is a big one where they're exploring the use of blockchain. Patient consent, we're working with the military health services and some of the HIEs to look at how patient consent happens. Because today, believe it or not, consent is very hard to track. And then when consent is interpreted to be there, there's actually a lot of data that's exchanged when all you may need to know is that that person had an MRI. And yet there's a 140-page PDF that's actually exchanged with data. And so military health services is much more interested in letting patients to consent on a more granular level. So those are some of the places. Clinical trials, the efficacy of clinical trials, right? So this is another place where NIH is looking at blockchain, because and other places, because there's no tracking that you belong to one clinical trial, and as a result of being in that clinical trial, you shouldn't be participating. And it's like, okay, well, is that really that big of a deal? Well, yes, because that starts to bear on the efficacy of the data that's collected in those clinical trials. So you can start to see where blockchain is really looking across a wide spectrum of information. We see that through grants management. I mean, it just continues and continues. So it's incredible, the breadth.
And you know, Rob, to add to Wendy, so as Wendy explores the discussion around the government public service side, the tie-in into the private sector is really indisputable. When you think about, as she was talking about the verticalization, even if you look at the information she was saying around there's no attribution around the data for those that have done discovery around solving health-related issues. That's the same thing that's basically would be called digital rights management and media and entertainment. Right? So you can see where the whole notion around intellectual property protection and then digital rights management is the attribution piece. But particularly, one of the things that we're very active in looking at in healthcare is many times we think about just patient care in healthcare or drugs. And many times when you are exploring in your own enterprises use cases, you often want to seek things that are very verticalized in the industry. The way we look at this is the problem in the ecosystem is vast. In fact, it's not a verticalization when you think of healthcare. It's actually very much a horizontal play. So everything's starting with patient care and the healthcare provider. You have the payer, which is the insurance programs associated with that. And then you also have the life sciences piece, which is in the pharma side. You have therapy services and other service centers that provide the care to the patient. And many of us know where you either pick up your prescription drug or you get your flu shot as your local pharmacy. If you start to look at the importance here, which is why this is not a technology looking for a problem, this is truly about entertaining business model change. And so when you start to engender across all of the different aspects, in this case healthcare, and you maybe lever as a beginning point something that is being regulated or mandated as a regulator, there is a vast opportunity to begin to apply blockchain around the securing, the immutable nature of the information, and mostly the transacting of it across the entire horizontal, done once, right? We all know, I think most of the people in this room are probably blockchain savvy. One of the things you're looking for to make a legitimate blockchain use case is are there multiple writers of the same data? Now, any of us who know what is the biggest problem enterprise faces today, it's ingesting data. more and more data is coming at us at a faster and faster rate. We can no longer ingest it to make it meaningful for our enterprises. And so if you start to think from an industry or a horizontal perspective, how you can ingest and inform data, do it once as multiple writers versus doing it many, there's a significant opportunity to be had there.
So to take that a step further, right, when we think about enterprise engaging in this space, heavily regulated across many fronts, right? Wendy's referencing this. So Tim, you think about it with the risk lens, and so can you maybe make it real from your perspective, how you're helping people engage and control the amount of risk? We're going down a space which has not been developed yet.
Yeah,
right?
one evidence that this industry, as is other regulated industries, is maturing is the ability to understand and mitigate the risk. So what we see a lot happening here, as is true with many of these industries, is that it's slowly, then quickly. And so it appears from the outside that not a lot is happening, but then suddenly you hit a pivot point and everything snaps into place. And a lot of those building blocks are being put into place by healthcare providers. And one of those is to understand the various layers of the stack. So for instance, are you running Hyperledger on AWS or Ethereum on Azure? What are the risks associated with each layer of each of the counterparties and each of the technology layers in the stack? How are those risks being mitigated? And also keep in mind, HIPAA, the healthcare privacy law, and HITRUST, one of the common certifications, those were all written and came into place long before blockchain became a thing. So they're not written from a perspective of even appreciating what the technology can do. So a lot of the mature providers in this space that see opportunity are looking at where there is substance over form, where they can work with good legal counsel, but working with their regulators in terms of explaining how these risks are being mitigated. So they're getting some level of cover ahead of the time to show that they are in fact going to be in compliance once they eventually roll out a solution.
Yeah, and it's interesting to counterbalance the risks. I think people are saying, gosh, we need to spend more time on this topic, but there's a real reason to engage. You talk about the role of the insurance provider and the patients and the doctors, and there's actually some tokenized business models out there where they're actually incentivizing people to engage, right? The more we engage with the healthcare provider and the insurance company, then wellness should theoretically increase, but people don't do that just because it feels good, right? They need a reason to do it. And so there's some innovative companies out there looking to tokenize different incentive programs, bring these parties together, and we see large-scale enterprises engaging in this topic as a way to do it. You mentioned track and trace, Wendy, which is pretty interesting. If they need to do this anyway to validate, where everything is in the supply chain, then why not tax sensitize that data and watch inventory moving through to tighten up your processes there? Why not look at tightening up customs, which is obviously a big deal watching this stuff. It's frequently crossing borders. And so can you tighten up those processes? We have some new legislation, which is now 2 years old, which looks at US-born products sold abroad, but you have to prove that it is used abroad. Well, to the extent that this is now tied into a blockchain solution, you can prove where it's used abroad, then this implementation of a blockchain track and trace solution actually helps you garner that benefit from a tax standpoint, which is roughly 8% of your tax rate at a federal level. So good stuff from a tax perspective. Are you seeing this? What about like RevRec and auditing? And Amy, how are you thinking about this space?
Yeah, well, it's similar to HIPAA. I mean, it's accounting standards and auditing standards weren't written with blockchain in mind. And so I think there's some challenges there with thinking through as transactions are on a blockchain. So you have a sale of a pharmaceutical drug or you have services that you provide to patients. How does that then translate into your books and records? So if you have that sale of a pharmaceutical drug on a blockchain, and then at some point you need to recognize revenue, right? How do you know who's the end customer? When did you actually deliver that pharmaceutical drug? Was it an arm's length transaction? So all of the guidance and requirements that we have in accounting standards, those are going to live on. And so we have to think about what in these blockchains, does it have the evidence in there that we can then use in order to support our books and records from a management perspective? And then being the auditor on the panel, how does that evidence then transcend into supporting your books and records to your auditors? So it's important anytime we're setting up these blockchains to facilitate this movement of value that we think about how am I going to then support how that value goes into my books and records.
So Rob, let me add something here. Again, I don't know the diversity of the audience here other than our polling questions, but one of the things we really want to bring to life for you on this panel is it's all too often we jump into new forms of technology and innovation, and I'm a technologist for 34 years. And we look at ways to automate things, we look at the new process, but we are blind to the impact of the auditability. As I've said before, immutability doesn't mean it's not auditable, right? So the audit function, the SOC 2 function, the risk and controls. Many of your project teams, if your project team is mostly technology-led, you will fail. You will fail. And I will go on record to say that strongly. You must involve your audit teams, your tax teams, your compliance teams. You must look at the auditability that you build into the code and the process and use the tools and technologies available to you to do that. So as you hear more of our insights here, we really want to make sure that if there's nothing you leave here with today other than open up your aperture, include more in the discovery process and setting up of your solution. How do you respond to a regulation if in fact your compliance team doesn't understand how to position it to be in compliance with whatever that test is that they run, right? So
Yeah,
I'll give it back to you.
I was
I get
similar
excited
point.
about
I
it.
know
Yeah,
that.
I'm excited about audit.
This is the right point to make, and you see where, when we have a client with a unique idea, we sort of wrap around them in a fairly comprehensive manner, and really proud of that, right? How we can do that, and that doesn't always come top of mind when you think blockchain, right? Your head goes first to technology, and to your earlier point, we're way beyond the technology piece. Like, how do you implement it? How do you make it work? And to have different competencies iterate with you in the business model journey is critical, right? Because you don't want to get too far down the line and say, oh, did you check with Amy, right? Whoopsie, big deal. we sort of need to keep our audit in a good place. So glad to have you engaged. Let's move then to a different industry. When I think blockchain first became popular, right? And Bitcoin really put it on the map. I think that's when all the hype started. People thought fintech first, right? And everybody's like running toward how this is going to disrupt fintech. And while we've seen it really gain an impact across every industry out there, fintech hasn't really led everything, but there's still a lot of meaningful stuff out there. We're seeing it in, digital assets for sure. We're seeing it in exchanges and custodians and wallet hosting, but we're also seeing a lot of large state and mature state enterprises engaging in this space, and that's really refreshing, I think, to a lot of people. We're seeing it gain a lot of traction there. So, Linda, think about how are you thinking about this in the fintech space, right? Mature state enterprise.
Yeah, I think one of the things we all benefit from fintech, being a critical party to driving this forward, starting with the crypto craze, is they are forcing regulations to be looked at. But moreover, one of the things they will solve technically is anytime there's movement money, we really care about latency, right? We care about performance, we care about resiliency. So all other industries are going to benefit from the payments platform that are defined. I think what's interesting out there, and you might be facing this yourselves in your own enterprises, where maybe there are people who are a little bit still cool to the notion of blockchain because they've followed a little too closely the crypto craze, and then where it's seen the variability of its performance. But the reality is no one can debate in any enterprise that we've moved to a much more digital state. And when we've moved to a much more digital state of how we transact, how we identify ourselves, and in fact, I often like to give the example, if your children ask to borrow money from you, they want you only to send it via Venmo. They're not interested in fiat anymore, right? So we're seeing some maturing, but again, the regulators, when there's the movement of money and transfer of value, play a pretty important role in what happens in fintech. And Amy, I know you've got some things.
Yeah, you frequently call this the sleeping giant, right? I mean, and that level of engagement, you're starting to feel it, right? The conversations are quite real, and I know you're taking this real serious, right? We're
of
engaging
course.
deeply.
So I think there is the potential to drastically change the capital markets with blockchain, and with that drastic change comes a lot of responsibility, right? To make sure that we do so in a thoughtful manner. I mean, we have a number of use cases that seek to drive down costs. They seek to get rid of a number of third parties that we rely on currently in the capital markets, and then significantly reduce settlement time of these transactions. And so a number of benefits, but also challenges. I mean, anytime we're going to drastically disrupt the capital markets, I mean, all of us, everyone in this room and everybody engaged in the capital markets has a responsibility to make sure that we do so in a thoughtful manner and that we mitigate the risk. So anytime I speak about fintech, it's exciting. It's the area that I'm most excited about, but it's also an area where we have to have cautious optimism and think about those risks up front. So the top 5 areas that I always say we need to focus on for fintech is anytime we're going to digitize an asset, thinking about how am I going to prove that that asset exists. If somebody says to me at the end of the day, you have this digital asset on your balance sheet, prove it to me. How am I going to prove it? Where is that evidence? And we're used to the traditional forms of assets that I could point to. This is my building. I own this building. Very different in this ecosystem. So thinking about the existence. The next would be ownership. So if I'm going to control an asset and it's on my books, how do I prove that I own that asset? And that I'm not saying it's on my books, and Rob also has it on his books too. So how do we make sure that we prove out that ownership and that unique ownership is mine? The third one is valuation. So really thinking through, you're going to have assets that are very frequently traded, and so that's great, but they're also quite volatile. So how do you think about that valuation risk if you have very volatile assets? And then you have the digital assets that are less frequently traded. And so how do you prove out the valuation of an asset that's less frequently traded? The fourth area is thinking through related parties and potentially legal acts. So there you might not know the counterparty that you're engaging with. And so how do you prove that it really is an arm's length transaction that you can record on your books and you could have revenue associated with it, and that it's not an illegal act as defined by the SEC and others that are going to be monitoring this space. And then the fifth area that I always focus on is internal controls. In my mind, it all gets back to internal controls. And management has a responsibility to maintain their books and records and have those controls in place. In this ecosystem, it's very important to have strong IT controls, cyber controls. As it relates to fintech, making sure that there's controls around commingling of assets. So if I'm a custodian in this fintech space and I have Linda's assets and Rob's assets and I commingle them together, when Rob at the end of the day wants his asset back, do I have appropriate books and records to say, yes, Rob, these are your assets and you can have them back? So this is an area that I think a lot of opportunity here, also a lot of areas that we all need to focus on from a protection of the capital markets perspective.
Yeah. And that myth out there that says, when are the Big Four, when is Deloitte going to engage in audits? Meet Amy, right? Thank you. This is good. We take this effort very seriously.
Yes, we do.
And we've been doing it for a while, and I know, Tim, you're a key component of this, right? Before we're going to take somebody on and perform any attestation, whether it be controls or financial statements, you're a very big part of this conversation. You're a big part of this conversation, bigger even. So how do you coach us and keep us grounded on that?
Yeah. So at Deloitte, we have a risk framework for each of these industries that goes deep, and we're constantly updating it in terms of the types of risks that each one of those layers I referred to earlier. But specifically in fintech, I mean, there's a number of things to be mindful of. And we think about it, at least from a technical level, through 5 different lenses. And each of these are going to be relatively important or less important depending on your use case. So security is one, right? It's just how is the consensus model working to ensure security? And these are all at tension with each other, so there's no necessarily perfect one. It's about finding the right balance. Privacy. Yeah, I think there's an increasing drive towards privacy, and I think we will see more and more of these systems having levels of privacy in them. Privacy is at some tension with security, right? Relative to your ability to analyze what's happening on the chain. And as Amy said earlier, it's no longer satisfactory to just to have preventative controls. You need to have detective controls that include some level of ongoing analytics and monitoring of what's happening on the chain. And if you are dealing with a privacy coin or some sort of system that limits or makes it impossible for you to do that, then you may have a control problem. 3 would be just the weight or cost of the chain. And what you'll see now is a lot of innovation going into how to reduce the weight of the chain. Obviously, you want to have chains that work on mobile devices. A lot of the privacy chains are upwards towards 100 terabytes in size, so really become impractical in terms of how they end up getting used. Speed is another one, right? So constant demand to kind of scale these, and obviously the speed of these is at tension with security, because the faster you're confirming transactions, the increasingly you have potentially an issue with regards to security. And then finally, the one that Amy mentioned, which is auditability. And auditability not only for the of the auditors, but auditability from a perspective of your own corporate interests, in terms of how do I know that everything is operating as it should in the chain system that I'm a part of. So those would just be 5 things I think to think about. The other thing is, in fintech, and this is true for healthcare, there are new big supply chains, a lot of counterparties operating in these business models, and you want to make sure that you are you want to make sure that you are looking out for what your interests are relative to just the technology that's being proposed, and the kind of risks that you have, as opposed to seeing it as being something that's just sort of being, if I don't participate, I'm going to lose out on a bunch of business. So we're seeing the smart companies really investing hard in understanding the types of risks and consortiums that are being proposed to them, and thinking about the long term. What's this going to look like in 5-10 years time? And what am I doing now from a design perspective to mitigate those risks?
It's always interesting to see Tim in the room with the CTO, who knows that he's just going to get he or she's going to get criticized so harshly by Tim, like, do I pass or do I fail? And within literally like 20 minutes of working with Tim, you feel the anxiety level come down in the room, because they're learning so much. They're nervous, right, about not just whether they pass or fail, but whether they can sustain these wild business models and not get into trouble. And they're quickly learning to collaborate with you and all that. So it's much less critical and much more collaborative, which is great. Thank you for your examples. Just to state the obvious, right? This world of digital assets, which is being really, thrust at us through different fintech models. With the tax lens, remember, this feels like money. It acts like a type of fund and a means of transfer. This isn't money. It's a type of property of some sort. When we transact with digital assets, this is a barter type transaction, and that's a very broad statement, and it's different in every part of the world. But this is a transaction type we're just not used to working with, right? This isn't fiat, right? And there's tons of transactions that may cycle around, and it may be a while before that transaction flow ever gets back to fiat, if ever. And we're just not used to living in this world. And you talk about risks and controls, but the tax lens on this is wild. We're just not used to living in this world. Things like basis tracking and triggering gain or loss on the use of a digital asset when you just went to go buy a cup of coffee. This is not normal for us. And every jurisdiction around the world is wrestling with this right now. But it's just different and it's clunky. And there's a lot of solutions out there, a lot of different ideas. There's not a ton of guidance. So when you go down this path and you seek counsel and you seek guidance, do so thoughtfully is my coaching to you, because it's really hard. And you can go too far down the path of developing these business models and not recognizing the complexity in having just millions of barter transactions that are just not quite reconciled. It becomes a problem. What's interesting in fintech is just the level of transparency that regulators may now have to transaction types, right? So are you seeing, Wendy, a level of engagement of the regulators saying, wow, this is kind of cool, this is easier to track than greenbacks, right?
So definitely there's a lot of interest there, and we see that with FinCEN, right? And
the IRS is interested, right?
IRS, right? Yep,
They're watching all these barter transactions real time.
Well, and that's another thing that's really interesting, is just the classification, right? There isn't a coherent and agreed upon classification yet, although it seems like we're trending in that direction with some of the recent regs and guidance that has come out. But I think the other thing that's super important when we talk about fintech is to realize what one of the largest financial institutions in the United States is, and that's the United States government and the Treasury, and the fact that on buy-sell transactions between the agencies, right? So all the different agencies all pay out through the Treasury, but they all have their own financial transactions. And there's $740 billion of buy-sell transactions that occur amongst these agencies on an annual basis. And around 2.7 or so are unreconcilable at this point, 2.7 billion, right? So not a small problem. And yet one where, again, if you look at the transparency, but you also look at the payment, the power of the payment technologies that are being developed, right? Can that be applied in government to start solving some really hard problems that are existing on a really large scale that people don't generally think about?
Awesome. So both useful as they're monitoring other enterprises, but could be a big solve for our biggest institution out there. Great, good insight. Okay, so we want to hit one more industry, and we'll talk about media and entertainment a little bit, which is pretty broad. One of my favorite clients right now, if you haven't studied them, read up on Tari. Pretty interesting platform to transfer digital assets. I'll give you the example. So how many Lady Gaga fans in the room? Come on, do not be shy. All right. So I'm a Gaga fan, and I am not sitting anywhere but the front row, but I'm not standing in line for those tickets, right? So what happens is I'm going to give $1,000 to some person who stood in line to get that ticket. They say they paid $200 for it. I'm going to give them $1,000. When that ticket then transfers over, Gaga gets none of that $800 of profit, right? But what happens if instead that ticket is locked down as a digital asset, and there's a smart contract wrapped around it that governs on the front end how much of any further ticket transfer goes to Gaga versus the promoter versus the venue versus whatever, such that if you lock that down as a digital asset and you then pay in tokens, then there's a real-time rev split to make sure that every party gets what they were entitled to on a real-time basis. Right? And this exists today. Tari's out there, it's working. And I love this example, not just because it's going to get everybody their fair share, but it applies broadly. This is talking about protecting the rights of IP that previous to today, you had to litigate, right? Nobody, unless it's a really big number, is going to spend their time to go and chase these contracts around and reconcile it. It's almost impossible, particularly in the secondary and third markets out there for all these transfers of digital assets. And this goes way beyond concert tickets, right? This goes to sporting events, this goes to song usage, this age-old problem of protecting IP rights and getting any use of them into the hands of the person. This is a really big deal. And we talk about this a lot. So the level of, not really disruption here, but the level of innovation, getting people what they need, this is a big deal. We've been talking about this a lot. Age-old problem. Linda, any?
Yeah, so for those in the media and entertainment space, royalty management is in many cases Stone Age. While there are some solutions out there from a software perspective, a lot of work that's being done in royalty management. Imagine in a movie production, the number of assets and the number of contracts that they have with any of the contributors to the production of that particular film. And so if royalty management today is being administered via tablet and stone, i.e. Excel spreadsheets, this is a complex area. And back to leakage, just as Wendy talks about in the US government, $2.7 billion problem, if you look in aggregate across the world around royalty management associated with film production and other forms of artist production, it's a gigantic problem. So one that needs careful attention and surely must and can be addressed through something like blockchain.
Absolutely. Tim, do you want to comment?
Yeah, in addition to monetizing IP, the other big opportunity in media and entertainment is obviously privacy, right? I mean, look at kind of what's happening with all the social media companies, and while they're complying with a legal contract, there's a strong sense that they've violated at some level some social contract in terms of how they're operating. The same is true for the digital advertising industry. It sort of works, but it works in a way that's far less than ideal today. And so if you think about what the future is of what blockchain can mean for how we deal with privacy, it can actually mean that all of your privacy rights can actually come to you, the individual, for permission. Right now, today, even though sites are building nice dashboards to help you manage your preferences, you've got to go to every single site and to actually go manage those preferences. In some cases, you don't even know which entities have your information in order to go to the sites. So the future is one in which it's possible, and a lot of companies are working on this, that all of your privacy preferences are held by you. And if any time a company wants to have access to any of your data, then they have to come to you and you manage it in one single spot. And you think about the power of that. It also then starts to pivot some of the monetary balance here, where today you don't get any monetary potential or upside for companies using your private data. Once you have control of it, suddenly then that potential is there. So, we're still some ways away probably from that future, but that's a future I see a number of companies working towards that I think will dramatically revolutionize this industry.
Big solves out there, right? So Amy, with the audit lens, right, and risk and controls, have you thought about these business models and how you're going to approach it?
Yeah, I have, and I think I love the Tari example. So continuing with that one, not just because I love Lady Gaga, but I think it's a powerful model. But when you think about setting up that type of structure, it obviously puts a lot of pressure on the controlled. So when you set up that smart contract initially and you say, okay, when that person stood in line collects the $1,000, how does that rev share go out? What are the different parties and what's their percentage? It puts a lot of pressure on the controls around that particular contract setup. So I think it's important to think of controls kind of in three main buckets. I mean, first is the initial setup. So what are the validation mechanisms that everybody is agreeing to? In this case, what's the different rev share amounts? And then you have the middle bucket of, okay, it's set up great, but it better continue working. And so what's the ongoing monitoring of that particular arrangement to make sure that the rev share doesn't get tweaked in this case? And then the extraction. And so once that rev share happens, you want to think about it in relation to, okay, well, I just now collected my $200 as Lady Gaga's press. How does that end up translating into my books and records and my rev rec? So I think there's three pieces. And I mean, the best blockchain is not going to solve for bad data. So if you have bad information coming in, you're going to get bad information out. So if it's not set up right and you don't have the right rev share percentages, the blockchain's not going to fix that. And so it's really important to think about your controls along the journey.
Excellent. And Wendy, there's been a lot of questions about IP protection and government. Is there? I know we're out there a little bit, right? But should government be interested in this and how people are protecting IP? And
I think there's conversation around it. I think when you think about the various types of IP in the Patent and Trade Office, things are probably not as optimally available as people would like, and I think there's probably some potential for blockchain to help with those things. But I don't know that the conversation has dived really deeply into it at this point in time.
Yeah, you see it as a potential long-term solve, right? We're probably advanced at this point. But
If I can go to your example, though, and it gets to your privacy, but probably a little bit more creepy. But in all honesty, government in many ways, it needs to keep people safe, right? And so if you begin to, I always take my clients on and imagine a world where, right? But now if you're controlling more that resale market of those tickets, you have the ability to know who is at an event, right? And what does that crowd look like? And are there potential bad actors in that crowd? We know, unfortunately, that some really horrible things have occurred. And behind the scenes, there's a lot that goes on to keep you daily, day in and day out, even in this venue right here, very safe. By our governments. And so that kind of information, getting down to granular levels of who might be at an event is important.
Yeah, we were musing about if the advancements of identity can track real time to transfers of digital assets that then allow access in a physical sense to different venues, is there a role of government there? And so we're a bit early for this, but conceivably, and we think about safety a lot.
Yeah,
so
and there are a lot of digital native rebels in the blockchain and cryptocurrency space that are hoping that they can create something that's just going to avoid the need for government altogether. It's a very immature viewpoint. The more mature viewpoint is how do you constructively engage with the regulators and get them on board? Because if you do that, you're going to help define where they go and how they get comfortable and the kind of regulation we're all going to have to live with. If you don't, we're going to end up with regulations that probably are not going to be ideal and going to, in some case, sort of suffocate some of the innovation that otherwise would have happened. So that's a role that we see ourselves playing, is helping sometimes be the intermediary, sometimes having conversations with regulators to articulate our clients' points of view in terms of why they can be comfortable with the technology that's being proposed.
Yeah, it's true. It's a common theme that we're seeing. Many of the regulators in this space publicly are being very sort of firm and a little bit scoldy, I think, is the tone that they're using, appropriately so, because there are bad actors out there. What we see, though, is that behind the scenes in private discussions, they're actually quite collaborative, right? The role of many regulators in the space, their mission is to not just keep bad actors out, but to promote, understand, and enable good commerce. And so we're seeing this, and there's a role for. I've really enjoyed when we can do that, to be proactive with the regulators and get things done for our clients. It's fun. Before we run out of time, just there's some enthusiasm. You can see it up here about what we're all excited about, and I'd love to just maybe free for all for just a second. Like, what are you most passionate about? Maybe just Tim, starting with you. Like when you see what's coming around the corner, right? What are you most excited about?
A couple of things short term that really have promise. One is the Taproot proposal, which is basically obfuscated scripting on Bitcoin. Really powerful in terms of the level of innovation that can bring to Bitcoin. Not giving any investment advice, but if Taproot comes to fruition, it's going to dramatically increase the value of Bitcoin. Bitcoin's probably going to go up in value as a result. So if you haven't read Taproot,
not investment advice.
We need a disclaimer on the screen.
Second one is just Mimblewimble. I think its potential, right, in terms of where we go in this space. And there's a couple of coin systems that have adopted it, Grin and Beam. So investigate that if you have a lot of potential there. Long term, though, distributed identity, I think, is the biggest thing I'm interested in, which is going to unleash a whole new wave of innovation once we get distributed identity figured out.
Love it. Wendy?
So I would say the new business models through tokenization. I think that we've gotten over the fundamentals of what is blockchain, and so now the ability, people are starting to really think about what's the power of converting an asset to a digital representation, assigning that through tokenization, and the power of an understanding that liquidity is associated with that. And so I think seeing some of those new business models and the wheels turning, even within my clients, on how that could be applied, is showing that maturation that you're kind of talking about. We're going to some of the more pragmatic and practical applications.
Good level of engagement. Thank you.
It's interesting, Wendy, and playing off of that in terms of the future and excitement. Collectively, my colleagues, we look at this new evolution, disruption, and change, whether it's emerging disruptor or enterprise. The single most important thing we measure is adoption. Right? There's a lot of ideas. I think all of us know there's no shortage of use cases that have been propagated out there. But the adoption piece is paramount to what happens here. And of course, as part of that, particularly on the enterprise side, is getting right consortium models, getting right the ability to be interoperable, not only in terms of governance, but down at the platform layer. And there's where the pragmatic part comes along from my perspective, is once these things are built, we all know, particularly when you launch product into the marketplace today, you got one shot to get it right. You hit a 404 denial of service error, and people don't come back to your site. And they only try it once. They don't say, well, maybe their server's down, let's try it again. So performance and resiliency becomes really important at the operation level of standing these things up, getting beyond the fascination around what the use case is, and getting into the operability component.
So I would say the potential disruption in the capital markets. I think there's a number of old, antiquated systems that it takes a long time to transfer value at a high cost, and there's just so much opportunity here to synthesize processes across different participants in the market and really work together to get lower cost, more efficiency, but a ton of risk here. So as the auditor, I say that with a ton of caution. I think it's important here to just really work closely with the regulators, which we've said, and I spend a lot of time in my role working closely with the regulators, auditors, management, but also the current participants. So thinking through what are the models today with the third parties, and there's a reason the third parties are there. So really understanding how the ecosystem works today in order to figure out how can we improve it and move it forward.
Yeah, I mean, for me, it's so much fun because over the last 6 years, I've worked with a lot of very early stage kind of companies in this space and primarily digital asset based. And to see them now come up with, working business models and not, going well beyond just the interface and the usability with the consumer, but integrating back with large scale business enterprises and watching that unfold, right, with our expertise. What does it take for these mature state enterprises to engage with these new business models? And they like it, and they're engaging, and they're investing, not just inventing their own stuff, but how do they integrate with some of the new stuff out there? So exciting to see that happen because the investment to make it work is significant. And they see the opportunity, it's matched, they take it serious, they engage with all of us to make sure they get it right. So very exciting stuff, so proud, right? We've come a long way. We have like 3 minutes. If there's any questions out there, we would love to take one or two. I'm not sure if we have.
Before we take the first question here, right literally diagonal from here is we have our client lounge. We have a few private sessions going on today. Some of the very things we're talking about that aren't on the consensus agenda, but also was dropped on your seat. This is just a summary page of the blockchain survey. Again, Deloitte.com, you'll find the blockchain survey out there.
Your time today is so appreciated because this is going beyond just what's in the survey, but what are we seeing that makes it real? Let's get behind it. And so hopefully that was useful, but I want to answer, we do have time for one or two questions. Yes, sir.
Testing. Is this on? All right, I'll just shout.
Yo. Yes. There it is.
Thanks for a great panel. You were talking about the importance of adoption. So both on a B2B and a B2C basis, how important is it that companies in the blockchain space market themselves as blockchain companies, both B2B and B2C?
Well, off the top of my head, it's not a question I've pondered, but I think the question is blockchain itself is the underlying enabling technology. It's really about the disruption of business models. And so while you may be a part of the solution, how are you fitting in categorically into the overall solution? So we don't lead, even in our own discussions, we don't lead conversations with clients about blockchain. We lead conversations with clients about the business problems that we're trying to remediate and how we solve for those.
Yeah, I would agree. It's just such an overhyped term that it's more often than not, if it's very prominent in your marketing, it's more likely than not going to lead to a level of skepticism about what is the true underlying business problem that you're able to solve. Because we see a lot of this, right, where it's basically a traditional problem that could just as well be solved with a database, but yet it's got blockchain labeled on it because they think that'll promote, customer acquisition, something like that. And increasingly, our clients are seeing right through that.
Yep. And to ground that out, I think if you're people that do use it as a means of advertising, just to very quickly state a pithy statement why it's important. What's the differentiator? Why do you need it? We get this question all the time, right? We invest with clients about building stuff out. It's important for us to just say why we went that route. What is the value it adds to the equation?
Other questions?
Hello? Yeah. I know Tim briefly touched on privacy coins and some of the issues that might come from them. Could you just elaborate slightly on what Deloitte's view on privacy coins are, and do they have legitimate use cases within blockchain and the wider society?
Well, it's a space that's evolving very quickly. I'm not going to tell you in terms of legitimacy, but they are popular. And I think we're going to see more and more privacy attributes in blockchains, as well as the types of coin systems that we've seen. So Bitcoin has got very little to no privacy, right? And that's one of its biggest flaws. But this is why Taproot is so potentially important, because it will bring a level of scripting with obfuscation to it. So you get the benefits of some of the Ethereum smart contract type technology, but you get it in a way that is preserving the privacy of the participants. So I think it's just something we're going to have to stay close to. And like I said earlier, it's all about balancing the risks, because anytime that you're introducing privacy components, you've potentially got greater issues with regulators if you're in a regulated industry. You've potentially got issues with security as well. You're also potentially going to have issues with weight and the cost of the chain. As we've seen with historical privacy coins, they're massive in terms of the chain. Mm-hmm. these are all problems that are actually being solved today. And my prediction is the next couple of years, we're going to see significant advancement in this area.
I know there was more questions to be asked. Our lounge is literally right outside those doors to the left, like 25 paces. So feel free to come and visit with us. We'll all be in there, as well as the broader team. Really proud of the team we have assembled, and thank you all so much. This is a good conversation. Thank you.